I grew up in a family of artists, art like painting. My dad got out of the war in '46 and used his GI Bill to go to an art academy in Chicago because he'd wanted all his life to work in art. Met my mother there. She had wanted to be an architect, couldn't find a college that would accept a woman, so she went for her second interest, which was animal physiognomy and animal art. So the two of them met there, and he was in commercial art when I was a small kid. He started an ad agency and continued doing commercial art. My mother did portraits of, fine art portraits of show dogs and show horses for wealthy people while I was growing up. So that's how they made a living. And I had no expectation of doing anything but going into art myself. And while I was a teenager, on weekends during the school year and summers, I would go to the Chicago Art Institute and take classes with live models and interesting instructors. And it was an amazing place. The school was sort of hidden inside the museum in a way. And if you knew which door to go out of, you could go out an unmarked door in a hallway and find yourself face to face with a Van Gogh or somebody like that. So it was really great for an art freak. But I was becoming disillusioned with it as a line of work because, of course, as a gung-ho teenager, I was all about fine art and exploring new things and that level of creativity. And working in art can involve either what we used to call pots and pans, which is basic commercial art for advertising. If you see an ad in the newspaper that's got a bunch of pictures of appliances or pans or whatever, that's all had to be drawn by somebody. So it's either that sort of thing or teaching were the two career paths I could see on the thing. So neither one appealed to me as a 18-year-old. So I was in college for my 1 year in college, and I got involved in a bootleg radio station where we were technically delivering our underground and psychedelic stuff to the campus by carrier current. That means you're broadcasting through the power system in the place, and people can plug an AM radio into the wall and it'll pick you up. But in actuality, we had run a cable up to the top of our 17-story building and made a giant loop antenna around the top. And we were carrying St. Louis 50 miles away. And at some point, we got our first visit from an FCC truck. So one of the guys was looking down and said, "What's that?" And I looked down, there's a van down there with a little loop antenna on the roof. So I don't know. Anyway, we were wise enough to disconnect our big antenna. We had just a little carrier current transmitter, and they said they figured it was an atmospheric thing that caused our signal to be picked up so far away, but and they explained how to make our carrier current thing good and blah, blah, blah. They were nice. And they went away that time, and then a couple other times after a couple of times they knew we were scamming something. But anyway, from that I got into, in my big year of school, into booking acts and beginning to think about production work. A buddy of my dad's in Chicago was Bruce Swedien. Bruce Swedien at that time was probably the highest paid recording engineer in Chicago. He worked at the best places. He did the biggest productions. I mean, that rousing orchestral Marlboro Man orchestration that was in all the advertising for that for decades was something he had recorded, for instance, that sort of stuff. But and before he moved out to the West Coast. Anyway, so I had been in studios with my dad, and I knew they existed from advertising and everything. And I began to think about maybe that was something to look into and not pursue art. So I got out of college in '69 and began booking folk artists and just as a way to have some cash flow and living the hip life, shall we say. At some pretty gritty places in the north side of Chicago. And I, at that time, at the end of the '60s, booking agents were still sort of like a chubby bald guy with a cigar who talked on the phone and sent out 8x10 black and white pictures of artists to convince people to book them. And I'm thinking, it's music, you got to hear it at some point. So I took one of my artists into one of the one of the big studios on some kind of graveyard shift bargain deal, and so I had some petrified folk guy out there in the middle of this big studio, and we recorded what I knew was a pretty lame recording, but it was a recording. And I had a little portable tape machine, and I could go into the folk clubs. There were several of them. It was kind of the end of the whole folk era thing about that time. I could go into Gate of Horn and some of those places like that in the afternoon, have a cup of coffee with the owner at the bar and play him a tape of somebody. And as bad as that first tape was artistically, it worked. Bang, I'm booking this guy. So I bought some 1950s recording gear, which at that time was only 10 years old, and began recording live tapes in clubs, mostly to help pitch the artists. Meanwhile, I was getting rapidly disillusioned with being Mama Duck to a half a dozen folk singers. So once I started realizing that people wanted to pay me to make recordings of them like that, without me booking them, I thought, well, maybe this is going to be better. So I pretty well cut loose the booking after just less than a year, and was hauling my stuff into clubs to record live recordings. So that was kind of the beginning of things for me then.